April 1775. A British ship crosses the Atlantic carrying a last chance at peace. 1. April 1775. A British ship crosses the Atlantic carrying a message meant to bring peace to the American colonies. But before that message can arrive, shots have already been fired at Lexington and Concord. Blood has already been spilled. Now, outside Boston, thousands of farmers and militiamen surround the most feared army on earth. In a single night, they will raise a fortification that will cost the British their bloodiest day in a generation. This is the story of how a battlefield defeat convinced America that victory was possible. To understand what happened that night in June 1775, we need to step back a little. The 13 American colonies, angered by taxes and laws imposed from far-off London, had entered open conflict with the British Crown. The spark came weeks earlier at Lexington and Concord, where British troops and colonial militiamen exchanged the first shots of a war neither side could yet fully imagine or fully understand the scale of. Boston, in what is now the state of Massachusetts, on the northeastern coast of the United States, became the center of the storm. There, roughly 6,000 British soldiers found themselves bottled up inside the city, surrounded on nearly every landward side by more than 15,000 colonial militiamen who were poorly armed but deeply determined to defend their homes, their families, and the land they had spent generations building. Before we continue, consider subscribing to support our channel. By late spring of 1775, the siege of Boston had already dragged on for weeks. British General Thomas Gage commanded about 6,000 regular soldiers, but they were effectively trapped inside the city. Outside the city, more than 15,000 New England militiamen ringed Boston. They were brave, determined men, but most had never fought a formal battle, and their gunpowder supplies were dangerously thin. Command of this makeshift army rested with Artemus Ward, a 7-year-old officer in poor health, with only limited experience leading men in combat. Even so, under his authority, the colonial leadership decided it was time to act. On the night of June 16th, roughly 1,000 men marched out in near total silence toward the hills overlooking the Charlestown Peninsula. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Seize and fortify the high ground at Breed's Hill before the British could discover what was happening and respond in force. Working through the night by the light of the moon, the colonists dug trenches and piled up earthen walls more than 6 feet high, using whatever tools and timber they could carry up the slope. By the time the sun began to rise, a small earthen fort had taken shape on the hilltop, a position strong enough to threaten every British ship anchored in Boston Harbor below. Just before dawn, a British warship anchored in the harbor, the HMS Lively, spotted the fresh earthworks and the men still moving along the ridge in the pale morning light. Its captain gave the order to open fire, and the first cannon shots of the day tore into the hillside, though the newly raised earthen walls held firm against the bombardment. General Gage, watching from Boston, understood what the colonial position meant. From those heights, cannon fire could reach his ships, and he made his decision at once. The hill had to be taken, whatever the cost. He ordered Major General William Howe to lead a direct frontal assault, gathering more than 2,000 of his best regular soldiers for the coming attack. For the British, this was about more than tactics. It was a chance to restore the honor lost during the chaotic retreat from Concord, and to prove that trained soldiers could crush any armed crowd of farmers. General John Burgoyne put the British mindset into words that day, insisting that disciplined troops were simply invincible against any disorganized mob. No one on either side of the harbor that morning could have guessed the coming afternoon would become one of the bloodiest days in the history of the British Army. Early in the afternoon of June 17th, rows of British landing boats began ferrying soldiers across Boston Harbor toward the Charlestown Peninsula, in full view of both watching armies. As they came ashore, more than 2,000 regular soldiers formed into tight, disciplined ranks, their red coats bright in the sunlight and their bayonets fixed and gleaming, ready for the long march up the slope ahead of them. On the American side, Colonel William Prescott moved along the earthworks, reminding his exhausted men to hold their fire and save every precious round of ammunition they had left. His order became legendary that day. Do not fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. A command born not of bravado, but of simple, brutal necessity, given how little powder remained. The British troops began their climb, weighed down by heavy packs and equipment, slowed further by fences, stone walls, and rough, uneven ground that had not shown up on any map of the peninsula. They pressed on regardless, marching in tight formation directly toward the silent colonial position waiting at the top of the hill. When the front ranks finally came within close range, the order was given, and the colonists opened fire all at once with everything they had left to give. The effect was devastating. Entire lines of British soldiers dropped where they stood, cut down by a wall of musket fire delivered at almost point-blank range. Stunned and bleeding, the surviving soldiers broke formation and retreated back down the hill, leaving dozens of their dead and wounded scattered across the slope behind them. Shocked by the scale of the losses, General Howe pulled his men back into formation and ordered a second assault, sending them forward again along almost exactly the same deadly path. Behind their earth and timber walls, the colonists reloaded in near silence, watching the red-coated lines reform below and begin climbing once more toward the summit. When the British came into range a second time, the same devastating volley tore through their ranks. And this second attack proved even more costly than the first, with some British units losing half their men or more in only a few terrible minutes, even as the American defenders inside the redoubt watched their own supply of powder and shot run dangerously, critically low. With ammunition nearly exhausted, Colonel Prescott ordered his men to hold their remaining fire until the enemy was almost on top of them. General Howe, sensing this weakness after two failed assaults, launched a third attack, ordering his men forward with bayonets fixed and instructing them not to stop and reload while under fire. The colonial defenders, now largely out of powder, could only manage a scattered, dying volley before the British soldiers reached the earthen walls of the redoubt. What followed was brutal, close-quarters combat, as British troops climbed over the walls and fought hand-to-hand inside the very trenches the colonists had dug only hours before. In the chaos of the retreat that followed, General Joseph Warren, one of the most respected and beloved leaders of the entire Patriot cause, was struck by a musket ball to the head and killed almost instantly. Warren had refused any position of formal command that day, choosing instead to fight shoulder to shoulder with the ordinary militiamen in the ranks, carrying only a musket like any other soldier in the redoubt. His death inside the fallen position turned him, almost overnight, into a martyr for the American cause, a name that colonists across the 13 colonies would remember and honor for generations to come. When the smoke finally cleared and the guns fell silent across the hillside, the true cost of the battle became impossible for anyone to ignore. British forces had suffered more than 1,000 casualties, killed and wounded combined, an almost unthinkable toll for a single afternoon of fighting by the standards of that era. The colonial militia, by comparison, had lost roughly 450 men in the same fighting. On paper, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a clear and undeniable British victory. In practice, it was a victory so costly that many British officers struggled to see it as any kind of victory at all. One young British lieutenant, walking across the captured redoubt shortly afterward, later admitted that he could hardly find words to describe the horror laid out in front of him. Bodies lay scattered everywhere across the small earthen fort, the ground itself soaked through with blood, and wounded soldiers cried out weakly among the dead and the dying all around them. The hilltop that was meant to prove the total superiority of the world's most powerful army instead looked, to more than one witness that day, like something far closer to a nightmare than to any kind of triumph worth celebrating. Word of the battle spread quickly through the colonies and eventually crossed the Atlantic to reach England itself, shocking observers on both sides of the ocean. For the British, this victory had come at a price that felt almost impossible to justify to the public back home. General Henry Clinton, present on the battlefield that day, later warned that a few more victories of this kind would be more than enough to finish off British rule in America for good, without any further fighting required at all. The lesson from that single afternoon was impossible to miss. The colonial militia, however untrained and poorly equipped, was fully capable of inflicting devastating losses on one of the most professional armies in the entire world, given the right ground and enough determination to hold it. In the aftermath, General Thomas Gage was recalled to London, held responsible in the eyes of many British officials for the heavy losses suffered at Bunker Hill. Command of British forces in Boston passed instead to William Howe, the very general who had personally led the assault up that bloody hillside only weeks before. From that day forward, Howe carried the memory of Bunker Hill with him, and it would go on to shape nearly every major decision he made for the rest of the war, making him far more cautious about ordering costly frontal attacks against any fortified American position. Meanwhile, in early July of 1775, a new commander arrived on the outskirts of Boston to take charge of the newly created Continental Army, George Washington. A wealthy Virginia planter and a veteran of the earlier French and Indian War, Washington found an army that was disorganized, badly equipped, and dangerously short on gunpowder and basic supplies of every kind. Despite the grim state of his new command, he set to work almost immediately, imposing discipline, order, and structure on the ragged force he had inherited from men like Artemas Ward. For the ordinary colonists watching from the surrounding hills, Bunker Hill had proven something far more important than any single tactical outcome. Despite the technical defeat, they had shown it was possible to stand toe-to-toe against the British Army and hold their ground for hours against trained professional soldiers, inflicting terrible losses along the way. That single fact, that real victory, truly was possible, spread through the 13 colonies and helped fuel a growing hunger for full and lasting independence from Great Britain. A few months later, King George III addressed the British Parliament directly, condemning the American colonies as being an open rebellion and promising a massive, overwhelming military response to crush the uprising once and for all. For many patriots who had still clung to some hope of peace, this speech was the final straw, and it was also precisely this combination, British shock at the cost of victory and American confidence born from the fight itself, that finally answers the question at the heart of this story: how a tactical defeat became the true beginning of victory, and how the Battle of Bunker Hill had already shown both sides, in the clearest possible terms, that the war ahead would be long, brutal, and impossible to walk back from. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Bunker Hill was only the opening chapter of a much longer journey, one that would eventually reshape the fate of an entire nation. If you enjoyed this story and want to see how that journey continues, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of the war that changed the world.